Section 3 of The Golden Web by E.Phillips Oppenheim. Book 1, Chapter 3, A Family Affair. A few hours later, Stirling Deane sat at a small round dining table, side by side with the father of the girl to whom he had been engaged for exactly 3 days. His hostess, the Countess of Nunnelly, and her daughter, Lady Olive, had only just left them. It had been a dinner absolutely a familia. "Draw up your chair, Deane, and try some of this port," Lord Nunnelly said. "Thank you," replied Deane. "I'll finish my champagne if I may." "Just as you like," his host answered. "I notice you are very careful never to mix." "Deane, perhaps you are right. There's nothing like being absolutely fit, and you fellows in the city must have a tremendous lot on your minds sometimes. I suppose, however prosperous you are, you never have a day without a certain amount of anxiety." "Never," Deane assented quietly. Lord Nunnelly, who had a great reputation as a peer of marked sporting proclivities, crossed his legs and leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette. "I never thought," he continued, "that I should be glad to give Olive to anyone, you won't mind if I say it, outside our own immediate circle. Of course I know your people were all right. I've ridden to the hounds with your father many a time, but when a family drifts into the city, one naturally loses sight of them. You will find me a model father-in-law, though, Deane. I never borrow money. I wouldn't be a director of a public company for anything in the world, and I haven't a single relation for whom I want a berth." Deane smiled. His manner was natural enough, but only he knew how difficult he found it to continue this sort of conversation, to keep his attention fixed upon the somewhat garrulous utterances of his prospective father-in-law. "You are very wise to steer clear of all that sort of thing, sir," he said. "The city is no place for men who have not been brought up to it, and the days of guinea pig directors are over." Lord Nunnelly nodded. "My lawyers have been making inquiries about you today, Deane," he said. "You insisted on my doing so, so I let them, although it was more for your satisfaction than mine. According to their report, you seem to have rather underestimated your position. They tell me that yours is one of the richest corporations in the mining world, and that you yourself are very wealthy." Deane inclined his head slowly. He leaned across the table and helped himself to a cigarette. A few nights ago he would have listened to such a speech with a feeling of genuine satisfaction. Now everything seemed changed. The rock upon which he had stood seemed to have become a shifting quicksand. Dick Sinclair was a blackmailer and a thief, he told himself, with a fierce desire to escape from the shadow which seemed somehow to have settled upon him. The document he had brandished was not worth the paper it was written on. His attack, even if he ventured to make it, could prove no more venomous than the sting of an insect. Yet the shadow remained. Deane, for the first time possibly in his life, felt that his nerve had temporarily gone. It was all that he could do to sit still and listen to his companion's easy talk. "Of course I'm glad enough for Olive to marry a rich man, especially as her tastes seem to run that way," Lord Nunnelly continued. "But I tell you frankly that I shouldn't have fancied a marriage for money pure and simple. I'm not a wealthy man, but I can keep my places going pretty comfortably, and I don't know the meaning of a mortgage. Olive will have her 1,000 a year settled upon her for life when she marries, and something more when I die. In a sense it's nothing, of course, but it will help pay for her frocks." "I am sure you are very generous," Deane murmured. "I had not even considered the question of dowry, so far as Olive was concerned." Lord Nunnelly nodded. "As I remarked just now," he went on, "I should have hated the idea of a marriage for money pure and simple. I have seen you ride the hounds, Deane, as well as any man I know, and there's no one I'd sooner trust to bring down his birds at an awkward corner than you. That sort of thing counts, you know. I always meant to have a sportsman for a son-in-law, and I'm thankful that your city life hasn't spoiled you for the other things. By the way, how old are you, Deane?" "I shall be 40 my next birthday," Deane answered. His host nodded. "Well," he said, "you won't want to go wearing yourself out making more millions, surely. Why don't you retire and buy an estate?" "I have thought of it," Deane answered. "I mean to take things easier, at any rate, after my marriage." Lord Nunneley sipped his wine reflectively. "I have never done a stroke of work all my life," he remarked, "beyond looking after my agent's accounts, which I have never been able to understand, and trying a little scientific farming, by which I have invariably lost money. I do respect a man, though, who has been through the mill and held his own, and against whom no one has a word to say. At the same time, Deane," he added, "don't stick at it too long. If you'll forgive me mentioning it, you don't look quite the man you did even 2 or 3 years ago." "I am a little run down," Deane said. "I am going to take a holiday in a few weeks." "You are coming to us in Scotland, of course," said Lord Nunneley. "But holiday or no holiday, take my advice. Even if you have to sacrifice a bit, don't stay in harness too long. The money you can't spend isn't worth a snap of the fingers. You and Olive could live on the interest of what you have, and there's scarcely a thing you need deny yourselves." Deane hesitated for a moment. "That is true enough," he said, "but it is never quite so easy, when one is involved in things as I am, to escape from them. The devil's spider spins a golden web to catch us mortals, and it's hard work to get out of it. I'm afraid that my shareholders would consider themselves very much aggrieved if I sent in my resignation without at least a year's warning." "A year?" Lord Nunneley remarked reflectively. "Well, I should feel quite satisfied if I thought that you were going to chuck it then. Don't misunderstand me, Deane," he went on. "Please don't for a moment believe that I am such an arrant snob as to mind having a son-in-law who's engaged in business. I look upon yours as a jolly fine position, and I can assure you that I have a sincere respect for a man who has attained to it at your age. It is simply that I fancy you are carrying a much heavier burden than you sometimes realize, simply for your own sake and Olive's, that I would like to hear of you taking things more easily." "I understand," Deane said. "I quite understand. You are really very kind, Lord Nunneley. Even if it is impossible for me to escape just the moment, I can assure you that I shall take the first opportunity of doing so." The butler, with an apologetic bow, came softly across the room and delivered a message. Lady Olive was going to a party, and would be glad if Mr. Deane could come into the drawing room at once. Section 4 of The Golden Web by E.Phillips Oppenheim. Book 1, Chapter 4, A Murder. Deane, with the air of one who was a habitué to the house, found his way to the drawing room, where Lady Olive was seated before the piano, playing softly. She rose as he entered, and came to meet him. "I have barely a quarter of an hour, Stirling," she said. "It was too absurd of you to be sitting there talking to father all the time. Come and say nice things to me. Mother has gone upstairs to put on her tiara." He held her at arm's length for a moment, looking at her. She was not very tall, but she was graceful, and she carried herself as the women of her family had done since the days of Elizabeth. Her face was a little cold, except when she smiled, and her eyes were large and brilliant. There was about her toilet and her features a sort of trim perfection, which left no room for criticism. She was considered, amongst those whom she called her friends, handsome rather than beautiful, and ambitious rather than affectionate. Nevertheless, she blushed most becomingly when Deane stooped to kiss her, and her face certainly seemed to lose for the time its somewhat cold expression. "You are going to the Waldrons, I suppose," he remarked. "You look charming, dear." She made a little grimace. "It's too bad that you won't be there. However, in a few days that will be all right. Now that our engagement is announced, everyone will send you cards, of course, for everywhere I go." He smiled a little doubtfully. "You won't expect too much of me in that way, will you?" he asked. "My afternoons, for instance, are nearly always occupied." "You will not find me exacting," she said, with a reassuring nod. I don't expect you to play the part of social butterfly at all. And although we must be seen together sometimes, of course, I haven't the least desire to keep you dangling at my heels. Tell me, what has father been talking to you about?" "He has been urging me to leave the city," Deane said, "and buy an estate." Lady Olive looked thoughtful. "That is very interesting," she said. "What have you to say about it?" he asked. "It depends," she answered, "very much upon circumstances. I am not sure that I approve of a man having nothing whatever to do. Besides, I have no idea how rich you are, Stirling. I think I ought to warn you that I am very extravagant." "I am delighted to hear it," he assured her. "I should dislike a wife who wouldn't spend my money." They were sitting side by side upon a sofa, and she toyed with her fan for several moments. Then she held out her right hand to him and allowed it to remain in his grasp. For Lady Olive, this was distinctly a lover-like proceeding. She was not at all sure in her own mind whether such a liberty was judicious, having been brought up always to consider any display of affection as utterly bourgeois. "It seems a curious question to ask," she said thoughtfully, "but after all, it would be only affectation to pretend that I was not interested. Tell me what your income is about, Stirling." "In round figures," he answered, "it is today, I should think, a trifle over 25,000 a year." She nodded approvingly, and yet without a great deal of enthusiasm. "We ought to be able to make that do," she said. "Do you mean that it would be as much as that if you gave up business? Perhaps you could give it up partially and keep a few directorships or something of that sort." "I could not give up my work at all," he told her, "for 2 years. I get a very large income from my company, and I have an agreement with them. Besides, my own interests are so woven up with theirs that I could not run the risk of having anyone at the head of affairs in whom I had not complete confidence." She nodded. "That is quite reasonable," she admitted. "You get holidays, of course?" "Naturally," he answered. There was a short silence. Lady Olive was half inclined to wonder why, having possessed himself of her hand, he made none of the other overtures which she had always understood were usual. Deane, however, was in no humor for love making. She had represented to him only a few days ago a part of his future life which was altogether inevitable, and which he could easily come to find pleasant enough. But just now there seemed to be a barrier between them. Notwithstanding Lord Nunnelly's kindness and his wife's approval, he knew very well that it was not only Stirling Deane who had been accepted as a suitor. It was the millionaire, the man of great affairs, the man of untarnished reputation. Dick Sinclair's threats were still ringing in his ears. He somehow felt that he was not even playing the game to be sitting there, holding the hand of this most exclusive young lady. "You are a little quiet tonight," she remarked. "Perhaps," he answered smilingly. "I am a little shy." She was inclined to take his words seriously. There had been moments before their engagement when he had certainly looked at her in a very different manner, when she had realized that if she really did say yes to him, she might find herself in danger of having to submit to something a little more vigorous than the ordinary love making she knew anything of. She had even made up her mind, with a faint blush, to submit to it, had grown to expect it. Somehow, although she would have found the admission distinctly humiliating, she was a trifle disappointed. "I wonder," she whispered, looking down upon the carpet, if you really need encouragement." She felt a sudden thrill as his arm touched her, a sudden sense of his enveloping presence. Then the door opened, and she withdrew herself quickly. The Countess came into the room, a curious replica of her daughter, except that her hair was gray and the light in her eyes a little steelier. "So sorry you're not going with us," she remarked to Deane. "Inquire if the brougham is waiting," she continued, turning to her maid. "No, don't bother, Stirling," she added, as he moved toward the door. "We are really in plenty of time." Lord Nunnelly came in with the evening paper in his hand. "Is there any news, George?" his wife asked. He shook his head. "There never is," he answered. "The evening papers aren't worth looking at now. Shocking murder, by the by, at one of the big hotels." Deane turned slowly around. "A murder?" he repeated. His host nodded as he lit a cigarette. "Fellow just arrived in the country," he remarked. "Supposed to have had a lot of money in his pocket. Found dead in his room about 7 o'clock tonight." "Do you remember the name of the hotel?" asked Deane. Lord Nunneley glanced at the paper which he still held in his hand. "The Universal," he answered. "That huge new place, you know, near the Strand." "Was the murderer caught?" Deane asked. "Arrested just as he was leaving the hotel," Lord Nunneley answered. "At least they arrested the man they thought had done it. Here's the paper if you have a taste for horrors." Deane stood perfectly still for several minutes. Lady Olive was buttoning her gloves and did not notice him. Her mother was standing at the farther end of the room, helping herself to coffee. Lord Nunneley, alone, was conscious of the change in his guest's expression. "Nothing wrong, I hope, Deane?" he asked. "You didn't know the fellow by any chance, did you?" Deane shook his head. He spoke very quietly and very distinctly. Except that he was unusually pale, his manner showed no signs of emotion. And yet, all the time he felt he was being stifled. In his ears was the singing of tragedy. "No," he said. "I never heard of him in my life." He crossed the room to help Lady Olive with her cloak. "Stay and have a smoke with me," Lord Nunneley suggested. "I am going round to the club in about an hour's time, and then I am going to pick these people up at a ball somewhere." "You are very kind," Deane answered. "To tell you the truth, I have just remembered a very important letter which I ought to have written. If you will excuse me, I am going to hurry away at once. I should like to catch my secretary before he leaves." Lord Nunneley nodded. "You'll have to get him to give it up," he said to his daughter. "Fancy having to write a business letter at 10 o'clock at night. Perfect slavery." "Shall I see you tomorrow, Stirling?" Lady Olive asked, walking with him into the hall. "We'll lunch if you like," he said. "Or shall I come to tea? I shall not be busy much afternoon." "I'm not quite sure what I have to do tomorrow," she answered, "but I think that I would rather that you came here. We'll meet sometime, anyhow. Good bye." He raised her fingers to his lips. "Enjoy yourself," he said. She shrugged her shoulders. "Absolutely a duty dance," she murmured, waving her hand. "I know that I shall be bored to death. By the by, Stirling, don't forget that in about 3 weeks' time I want you to give a luncheon party at the Carlton to Julie and her husband and some of the others." "As soon as you like," Deane answered. "Julie won't be back till then," Lady Olive said. "Au revoir." End of section 4.